Good afternoon, or good morning. This is our fourth IBBY Australia talk. My name is Margot Lindgren, and I'm going to talk to you today about some international picture book illustrators and show you examples of their work. Our first IBBY talk in this season, we covered translated picture books. We weren't able to record that session, but I will be referring to some of the books that I mentioned on that session in November. Our second session, we had an interview with Julia Marshall from Gecko Press. Our third IBBY talk was silent books with myself and Dr. Robin Morrow. And now we have our fourth IBBY Australia discussion looking at international picture book illustrators. Apologies in advance if I mispronounce an illustrator's name. I'll do my best. Some of these may be familiar to you, and I'm sure I'm going to not quite get their names correct. And most of the books I'll refer to today, you can read a little more about on my blog. The reference to those below. Some things to think about just before we begin. Not all children are lucky enough to go to an art gallery, so perhaps the art they see in a picture book the illustrations may be the only art a child sees. I think we need to expose children to lots of different art styles. Not just because they will see other lives and hopefully they'll see themselves and they'll see others, but they'll also see different ways of representing the world. The aims of IBBY match beautifully with the discussion of international picture book illustrators. IBBY's aims are to promote international understanding through children's books and to give children everywhere the opportunity to access books with high literary and artistic standards. So I'd probably pop in the word high artistic standards because that's what you're going to see today. I found this beautiful little quote and it just really encapsulates the things I'd like to say today. Bringing illustrations from different cultures into our classrooms is important. Children need to see different interpretations of reality, as well as experience a variety of styles and techniques. And what you can see at the bottom of this slide are 3 illustrations from illustrators that I'm going to talk about today. So I'll be actually looking at the work of these 3 illustrators. Just in your mind's eye, conjure yourself up a picture of Cinderella. That's where I'm going to begin today, having a little bit of a look at illustrations or picture books with the story of Cinderella. So just in your mind's eye, think about Cinderella. I wonder if the image in your mind matches any of these. So I found about 12 picture books that retell the story of Cinderella from all around the world. Here we've got one from the Netherlands, one from the USA, and one by Joy Cowley with an illustrator from Korea. It's worth hunting out these Joy Cowley editions. She has a whole series of fairy tales and folk tales, and she often uses Korean illustrators. There's a lot of them for you to explore. They're not very expensive, they're paperbacks, so that's a series well worth hunting out. Then we have a Cinderella from Iran and a very different one from Mexico. And one of my favorites, this Cinderella from Czechoslovakia. If you can get hold of this, it's a little bit expensive, but it's a beautiful, beautiful book to share, perhaps with an art class or a senior primary class, or just hunt for this particular illustrator because all of her work is really, really interesting. And then I have some versions of Cinderella from China and Korea and Cambodia. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that each of these is such a different style, perhaps a style that you've never seen before, and yet you do know the story. So it's interesting to explore the way different people represent the story of Cinderella. And finally, I have one from the Caribbean and a Cinderella from Persia, and a really fun version, a fractured fairy tale version, Cinderella, an Australian Cinderella. If you haven't seen this one, it's just good for a little bit of a laugh. It's just a funny one, and it'd be good to contrast with some of those other more serious retellings. So here's a map showing the different places in the world these illustrators I'm going to discuss today have come from. As I said, I'm not particularly good at pronouncing names that I'm unfamiliar with or I haven't heard the name spoken. So apologies in advance if I kind of mumble up their name a little bit or don't say it quite correctly. So I've tried to cover a range of places in the world to give you a sense of different illustration styles. I'm going to start with Margot from France. He actually grew up in North Africa. The Red Piano is an older book that he wrote in 2010. His new books certainly are quite different and really cater to a very young audience, even down to preschool. So in Welcome, we have 3 polar bears living obviously in the Arctic Circle. Everything's okay until the ice they're standing on breaks away and they find themselves floating on the ocean and their ice begins to melt. So of course there's an underlying message of global warming. But there's also a message in this book about acceptance and refugees and displaced people, because the polar bears float off to little islands over the oceans, and every island they go to, they ask if they can come and live on that island, and at every turn they are rejected, till finally they find an empty island. It's in a tropical place. They move onto the island and life is great. They've got their hammocks and they're playing games and they're happy, until the day a group of monkeys arrive. And so now we've got this dilemma. The monkeys need somewhere to live. What will the polar bears say? Will they indeed say, welcome? Barreau is probably most famous for Where's the Starfish? And it's a book, almost a wordless book, with a very strong environmental message. You can see from this really harsh illustration here the kind of message that's contained in this book. Where's the Elephant is about deforestation. And I just included another cover there, Starfish, Where Are You? It's the same book, it just has been reissued with a different title. Beautiful, beautiful, colourful illustrations, certainly will appeal to a very young child, but hiding underneath is a very powerful message. And the keep an eye on Ivy. I just popped this one in here just to show you a little bit more of the style of Barreau and give you a sense of the way he draws his illustrations, the colours he uses, the little use of pencil lines. So that looks like a beautiful book. Sonia Danowski has a very, very different style. She actually reminds me quite a bit of Jane Tanner. She uses models for her illustrations, often her own home, her own children, and she's very keen to put lots of little details into her illustrations in the background, little things on window ledges, little paintings. So each illustration that she has in her books, it's really worth taking quite a bit of time just to really look into all the little details. What you can see here is a page from Little Nightcat. So the mum is a musician. There's a piece of music at the back of the book. Mum is a cello player. And they're going to a fair, which is a fundraiser for an animal shelter. And the little boy is really keen to help the animals. So he suggests to his mum that he should probably donate all his lovely soft cuddly toys. His mum's not so keen to do this, but she agrees they can. So they load up bags with all the toys and they take them down to the fair. It's a very successful day. His mum plays the beautiful Little Night music. It's beautiful. It's original composition, I think, by Sonia Danowski. And at the end of the day, all the toys are sold. That night, when the little boy comes home, he reaches for his cuddly in bed, and of course, he doesn't have anything to comfort him. But his mum suggests they look in a cupboard, and she's still got a very, very old toy from her childhood. The eyes have kind of fallen off, so they repair the toy, and that night the boy settles down to sleep. But the real surprise comes the next day. The cat you can see on the front cover of the book was at the animal shelter, and somehow the little boy and the cat had quite a connection. And when he comes home from school, the cat has been adopted into their family. So it's got that glorious happy ending. And just included this one because it really shows you all the detail that Sonia includes in her art. Beautiful, the pastel colours. You can see little things on the window ledge, as I mentioned, and right down to the timber. It looks so textured. So I really think she's one to seek out. If you haven't met Mies van Hout, I can't sing her praises enough. I just adore her picture books. The one called Friends is part of a series. There's 3 or 4 in that series. I'm going to show you some more pages from those. Of course, not all of her books are in English, but there's about 20 that are available in English, so you might be able to seek some of those out for your library. Here's Happy and Surprise. And what happens in these books is they've got a black background with these vibrant animals and monster creatures all done in crayon. And then on the other side of the page will just be a single concept word, but the illustration obviously takes things so much further. So if you look here, these are all the words in the book Friends. that's every single word in the sequence of the book. So the text is extremely simple, but there's a real richness to the illustrations, and I'm sure there's tons and tons to discuss with a group of children or just with your own child. If you just look at the emotional trajectory of these words in the text: play, bore, tease, fight, cry, ignore, embarrass, hope, make up, trust, laugh, cuddle. I hope you get a sense of how that text works. And I think these books really would inspire a young child to grab their own box of crayons and have a try reproducing the art style that they see from these Van Hoots. Pete Grobler is a South African illustrator, and what I really love about his work is his use of pattern. So I'm going to show you a close-up from the Magic IBBY tree in a moment, but I'm sure you can see there the snake is all covered in a pattern. And of course, this is a great introduction to reinforcement of all the African animals. So this is a page from the Magic IBBY tree. And what happens in the story is that python has curled himself around the tree and all the animals are prevented from eating the delicious fruit. So the python says you need to be able to name the tree. They have to go to the king, the lion, and seek the name and come back. And if they can say the name, it's a bit like Rumpelstiltskin, then he'll release himself from the tree and they can grab the fruit. So they're all very, boasting and showing off that they can find out the name. But of course, in the end, it's the little tortoise who actually has the way of remembering the name on the journey back from the lion. All the Wild Wonders is a poetry book, Poems of the Earth. It's all illustrated by Pete Grobler. That's a beautiful book. That's well worth looking for. Reza Dalvand, Mrs. Beebe's Elephant, I'm going to go into a fair bit of detail about, because this is one of those wonderful picture books that's really for all ages. It's a picture book that you could read to a fairly young child, maybe 6 or 7, and then you could certainly read it with a group of older students in senior primary. Mrs. Beebe has an elephant. He's her pet. She loves her elephant. They have a beautiful relationship. She takes her elephant for walks through the small town, and that's when things turn difficult. The people in the town don't like the elephant disrupting their traffic. They're suspicious of the elephant. They don't understand why Mrs. Beebe needs to have an elephant. So they banish the elephant to the zoo. Mrs. Beebe knows the zoo is not the right place for her elephant. They both spend an uncomfortable night. She has to leave the zoo and leave her elephant behind. So the next day, Mrs. Beebe decides the only thing to do is actually to leave the small town. You can see the anger of the people in that illustration. But once the elephant and Mrs. Beebe have left, there's an emptiness. The children notice it first of all, but something very vital is missing from their community. And so it's now up to everyone to work out a way to solve this problem. Perhaps we need pets, but perhaps we also need to find a way to invite Mrs. Beebe back. This is another book by the same illustrator, quite a different style of illustration from the previous slide. I haven't actually seen this book, but I just love the idea of it, that this is the book you might give to a young child, or to a family with a young child just arriving the day of your arrival. And I really love the look of this illustration, the way that we can see the height of the adults, but we don't have to see their faces. The little children are sort of like the focal point in the picture. Just looks really special to me. I'm very keen to see this book. This illustrator from Iran, I want to spend a little bit of time on When I Coloured in the World, because this is another one of those books that's certainly for older children. You could read it to a younger child, but I think you would have a lot to discuss with an older child. It is a colours book, but it's also a book about our world, concepts about peace and war. The Bottle of Happiness is also an interesting one if you can seek that out. You may have heard of Pippa Goddard before. So in If I Coloured the World, every page is a double page like this with a full illustration on the left and some text on the right. And the idea is that the little girl in the book has an eraser, or she rubs out whatever the word is. So in this case, she's rubbed out desert and she's changed it to roses. And then there's a repeated refrain. So see how at the bottom it says, with my red crayon, I made roses grow all over the world. I gave the world red. So I gave the world, and then whatever the colour is. And some of the colours are a bit unexpected. There's violet and silver. So they're not your standard, just, you know, red, green, blue. And then this one's on hunger. I rubbed out the word hunger and I wrote the word wheat with my green crayon. Green wheat, I made wheat grow in more fields all over the world. I gave the world green. Some of the other concepts in the book are darkness and light, drought and rain, war and peace, crying and laughter, illness and health, despair and hope. There's a beautiful animated video of this book. It's not just a reading of the book, it's actually been carefully made by Tiny Owl. So if you typed in when I coloured the world, when I coloured in the world, and maybe hashtag fly with Tiny Owl, I'm sure you'll be able to locate the video. Anna Kuna has a whole different style again. I'm going to talk quite a bit about Anita and the Dragons in a moment, but just before I do, I'll just mention that A Story About a Fear is actually a poem. It was written by a Jamaican poet. He sadly died in 2017, but this book has beautiful illustrations of a little girl who wanders through different environments, and her clothing, her dress, reflects the environment that she's in. Anna says of her own work, I think my greatest challenge as an illustrator is to avoid being literal, creating other possible stories and leaving gaps and blank. I want to create other possible stories and leave gaps and blank spaces for the reader. In Anita and the Dragons, the little girl lives in the Dominican Republic. It's the other half of the island, which is shared with Haiti. And this is a migration story. We don't know much of the circumstances of why the little girl needs to leave her island paradise, but we get a sense that there is a level of poverty. There's no electricity. The education opportunities are very limited. When you get this book, the end papers, I just want to especially mention, it's like someone took some tracing paper or transparent paper and painted a beautiful soft wash illustration over the top. You almost feel that if you touch it, it will feel kind of like crispy tracing paper or something a bit, a whole different texture. The end papers are just beautiful. So this is one of the illustrations from the book, which gives you a sense of the different style. She uses mixed media and digital art. And at this stage, I think Anna's probably got about 3 or 4 books that she's illustrated. This is an illustrator from Colombia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about As Time Went By. I haven't seen Refugees, but I wanted to put it here because I've read quite a bit about it and it certainly sounds very, very interesting. I've certainly popped it onto my own shopping list, as I have A Page in the Wind, which is the journey of a piece of newspaper, which just seems like a really quirky concept. I think perhaps has some political implications because the illustrator comes from Colombia, but I'll need to see the book to know that for sure. So in As Time Went By, we have this large ship, and initially it's used as a luxury cruise ship. The story is told in 3 parts. So in the first part, you focus on the ship, which you watch as it becomes old and then put to different purposes. In this illustration, it's being used as a fishing boat. And eventually it falls into complete disrepair and is abandoned in the harbour. In the second act of the story, you meet some villagers. Some people are living quite wealthy lives. Then we see them reduced in circumstances and they're living in a small house and then a small apartment and then eventually just 1 room. Finally, the landlord of the village comes and he evicts everyone from the village. And you see a scene which we've seen in many refugee picture books of everyone just walking away with their suitcases. They can only walk in one direction, and that's towards the harbour where they see this boat that's been abandoned and is really it's probably rotting in the ocean. And they climb aboard because there's nowhere else to go. They've hit the water, and then over time you see the people restore the boat, make it work again. They build their little huts and houses on the deck of the boat, and there's a promise that there's certainly going to be a better future. It's a very different sort of picture book. The whole story has really lingered with me, and it's one you might want to investigate. I'm not going to spend much time on this illustrator from Colombia, except to say that 2 White Rabbits is one of the most moving books I've ever read. I don't own this book, and I wasn't able to access a copy, but this is an illustrator you will want to look for. Very different work and very, very powerful storytelling. This is an illustrator from Laos, and but I think if you look closer, you'll agree with me that her art looks very, very Japanese. She now lives in Paris, and the Miyuki stories, I think there's about 4 or 5 of them. So she's kind of famous for those. Here's a close-up of one of the illustrations from Time for Bed, Miyuki. Very, very beautiful decorated illustrations, very, very Japanese looking with that little girl and her haircut. I think she's based on the author's daughter. But in particular, I wanted to mention this one called Beautiful Day. This is a book of haiku, but not necessarily traditional haiku. It's modern haiku, which takes liberties with the pattern of syllable counts. So it's not strictly in the rigid form that you might expect for haiku. I love the illustrations in this book. So you can just read these haiku, just standalone, read one at a time, or you can read it right through as a story, and we follow this little character through the seasons and their interaction with their environment. There's a beautiful illustration where there's a dog with a grasshopper resting on their nose. If you have a look on my blog, I've put that, and I've also put some of the languages that this book is also available in. And we're nearly at the end. I did mention this Japanese illustrator when I talked about silent books. I think, or in my previous talk, I mentioned the piano recital. What I like about her art is it's just a whole different perspective. So we've got the graphite pencil. In this illustration, the viewer is looking up to where the child is looking out the window. She often puts the viewer in a whole different part of the picture. And it's just a very contrasting style. I think a very, very appealing illustrator. So one last thing to think about is some of these books will be a little bit difficult to get. And the other sad thing is, of course, many wonderful works from these illustrators are not translated into English. So a huge call out to well done the publishing companies that have taken the trouble to translate these books. And let's hope that many more will be translated in the future. Thank you.